NASCAR on Prime lights up Music City. Who's got what it takes to tackle the concrete at Nashville Super Speedway and walk away with NASCAR's coolest trophy? Stream the NASCAR Cup Series at Nashville, Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, where music meets motorsports, only on Prime.
You're listening to DNA ID, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Citizen Detective, and Campus Killings. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
It was 1987. Russell Haney had a job to do. Someone was paying him to reserve one of the in-demand picnic tables in the camping area at Thumb Butte State Park. It was a summer weekend, and a local Prescott, Arizona family was planning a large party at the park for friends and relatives. So they paid Russell, who was a transient, lived in the park, and worked odd jobs, to sit at one of the, quote, better tables and hold it for them until the party kicked off around 11 a.m. on Saturday, June 13th. Russell took his role seriously and arrived at the Thumb Butte Park picnic area at 6:30 a.m. He selected a table stationed at the base of the trailhead that fed into the two trails ascending to Thumb Butte. Sitting there, Russell had nothing but time to observe his surroundings. And at 7 a.m. or so, a young woman came pedaling up on her bike. Russell noticed that the young woman was wearing red shorts and a blue backpack, and a bright yellow bike helmet. Her long, dark hair spilled out from under the helmet. She pulled up and chained her bike to the Forest Service sign, took off her helmet, strapped it to her backpack, and started toward Thumb Butte. As she passed him, Russell briefly said hello to her, and she responded before trekking up the East Trail Hill. Russell sat there for about another 15 minutes, he thought, and then he heard a distant scream from up the trail. He thought nothing of it. He often heard kids playing and screaming as they ran around the park, so he continued his vigil at the picnic table, unfazed. Soon after he heard the scream, a man and a woman arrived at the trailhead and started up the trail to Thumb Butte. But before too long, they came down hastily, exclaiming that there was a girl's body lying on the trail. It looked like she'd fallen and hit her head. The couple, Roger and Opal Waugh, flagged down a pickup truck driving by the picnic area and told the driver to go summon help. Then Roger and Opal grabbed a blanket from their vehicle and headed back up the trail. Yavapai County, Arizona Sheriff's Detective Gordon Diffendafer was called by dispatch at 8:45 a.m. By the time he arrived at Thumb Butte Park at 9:33, Forest Service personnel and fire rescue unit members were already at the base of the Thumb Butte Trail. They directed him to a spot 300 yards up the trail. 2 Forest Service employees were guarding the body, which lay on the trail covered by a plum-colored blanket. 200 feet further up the trail, Detective Diffendafer saw Deputy Starrin and Lieutenant Bender, who were attempting to follow a trail of blood droplets. The drops led uphill from the body and ceased after about 150 feet. The trail itself was an evidentiary mess, with footprints all over it and hikers and climbers having ascended toward the butte even after Opal and Roger found the body. In fact, a female hiker named Elizabeth Reeder had discovered the body after the Waughs had found it, coming upon it when they went down to get the blanket and summon police. But first, she found something else. Elizabeth was walking down the trail from the summit, heading toward the campground, when she saw something on the ground. She stopped and picked it up. It was a Craftsman ratchet wrench. She decided to bring it down to the campground in case someone there had lost it, so she picked it up. She carried it with her about 150 feet, and then she started to see the blood drops on the ground. After another 150 feet or so, she saw what the couple before her had seen, a woman's body lying on the trail. She put the wrench down on the ground and checked the woman for a pulse. There was none. Elizabeth headed down to the trailhead and encountered Roger and Opal heading back up with their blanket. Lee R., a firefighter and EMT at the Central Yavapai Fire Rescue Unit, was one of the first responders on the scene in response to a hiker down call. When he arrived, it was already a chaotic assortment of witnesses, Forest Service personnel, detectives, and a Lifeline ambulance paramedic named Taylor P. Taylor advised Lee that the fire rescue unit would not be needed, and detectives were trying to clear the crime scene. Detective Diffendafer observed the body of the woman on the trail. The paramedic, Taylor P., had already informed the detective that she was deceased. Detective Diffendafer noted the woman's clothing did not appear to be disturbed. She was wearing red cotton shorts, a pink and blue bikini top, gray socks, white leather tennis shoes, and a blue canvas day pack, with a bright yellow bicycle helmet attached to it. Her hair was in a ponytail. She had a purple ribbon around her throat, but it was decorative, not strangly. She wore no jewelry and had nothing in her hands. Nothing immediately appeared out of place, except the blood, quote, literally covering her arms, leg, face, and chest. This sets the scene from Detective Diffendafer's report, quote, the victim was lying on her back with the backpack still in position and was leaning toward her left side. Her head was uphill on the trail, and her left leg was bent with her left ankle under her right thigh. It was evident from the manner in which the blood ran on different parts of the victim's body that she had been in different positions during the time that the blood was running over her. Inquiring of the other deputies present, Detective Diffendafer learned that Deputy Starren had moved the body slightly to see if she had identification in her backpack. But that didn't account for what the detective was observing. He noted lividity on the back of her right calf, which was not the lowest part of her body. He concluded that this indicated she had been moved at least a half hour after death. He was beginning to think this was not an accidental fall. Plus, the wrench picked up by Elizabeth was 3 feet from the body, and he quickly learned she had found it up the trail. Detective Diffendafer followed the blood trail up to where Starren and Bender observed it end. It was there, 120 feet up the trail from where the body was found, that he concluded the young woman had been assaulted by someone. Again, from his report, quote, the blood trail indicates that the victim was either carried or made it on her own from the point of initial assault to where she was found. No blood was found on the trail downhill from the body. Examination of the scene surrounding the victim's body showed several large spots of blood and numerous smaller spots and drippings of blood. It appears from this that the victim was probably assaulted again at the location where she was found. End quote. Another item of significant evidentiary interest was retrieved. A CCI .22 caliber long rifle cartridge case was found on the ground 6 feet from the dead woman's head. The body was removed at 11:13 a.m. to the Yavapai County morgue. Papers and materials in the woman's backpack indicated that her name was Cathy Sposito and she was 23 years old. Detectives and deputies fanned out to try to determine where her assailant had gone. Just to give some context, Cathy was on the main trail up Thumb Butte, which punctuates the Prescott National Forest and provides a panoramic view of Prescott. The trail is forested and is a 2.5-mile loop. Trail number 33, as it is labeled, is considered a moderately difficult one. It's open only to hikers, no horseback riders, mountain bikers, or anything like that. It was a place of peaceful enjoyment of the natural surroundings. The trail itself swathed through rocky, dry terrain, which made it impossible to tell if anyone had run off into the surrounding woods, and no one had seen a bloody person walk down into the campground area. At 2 o'clock that same day, on June 13th, an autopsy was performed on Cathy Sposito at the Yavapai County morgue by Dr. White. Reading the autopsy results, I was shocked at how badly messed up Cathy was. All of this went down on a public hiking trail at a popular park in daytime in the summer. In Arizona in June, the hiking trails are more likely to be crowded in the morning hours before it gets too hot. Whoever did this to Cathy was either brazen or crazy or both. Dr. White observed that Cathy had 12 to 18 lacerations and tears on the top, sides, and back of her head. These were not from a fall. Cathy was murdered. Some of the lacerations were believed to have been inflicted by the ratchet wrench that Elizabeth R. found up the trail. Some of these injuries appeared to have been caused by blunt force trauma from a hard, irregular surface, which the pathologist posited might have been a rock. But others looked as though they were caused by a sharp cutting instrument that the pathologist believed was a knife. Cathy had what appeared to be a knife cut to her right ear, which extended into the interior part of the ear. She had a broken nose, and a right front upper tooth was broken out, likely by a punch to the face by a left-handed person. She had 3 cuts on her forehead above the left eye, which ran parallel. She had 4 cuts on her right hand, which looked like defensive wounds caused by a sharp instrument, such as a knife. But she also had numerous abrasions on her buttocks, indicating she'd possibly wrestled on the ground with someone. A quote from the report: Dr. Wyke felt that the struggle occurred while the victim was in a sitting position, while the assailant was standing above her, striking her on either side of the head with an object. End quote. Blood got onto her thighs during the skirmish. There were no drag marks evident, indicating that she got to where she lay by being carried or under her own power. What was shocking was that under all the blood and traumatic injuries, Dr. Wyke determined that Cathy had been shot in the left eye. She'd been shot at a downward angle while her eye was open. The bullet passed through her head on a downward trajectory, lodging in the muscle in her neck just below her skull. It didn't impact the brain cavity and was not, in and of itself, lethal. Stippling around the eye indicated that the muzzle of the weapon was 6 to 12 inches from her face when it was fired. Dr. Wyke removed the .22 caliber levoloid-coated lead bullet and placed it into evidence with Detective Diffendafer. The cause of Cathy's death was a combination of trauma to the brain and blood loss. The pathologist felt certain that Cathy had been moved after she was dead. Remember the blood settling patterns. But she'd been lying there for 15 to 30 minutes before Detective Diffendafer arrived and observed the scene. Dr. Wyke concluded that it did not appear Cathy had been sexually assaulted, but he collected oral and vaginal swabs anyway. He also carefully gathered samples of the blood in and on Cathy's mouth, where her tooth was broken. He collected and placed into evidence hairs found on Cathy's right hand, numerous hairs found on her right knee, pubic hair combings, fingernail clippings from both hands, hair and blood standards from Cathy, and all of her clothing. These consisted of her red shorts, lavender t-shirt, white tennis shoes, bikini top, underwear, socks, and her blue backpack. All of these items were sent to the Arizona Department of Public Safety Crime Lab in Flagstaff for analysis. Bob Blackett was the analyst assigned to the case. You'll hear that name again throughout the episode. Blackett determined that Cathy's blood type was O. He also analyzed the bullet taken from Cathy's head and the bullet casing found at the scene, and concluded that they were consistent with 2 different types of guns, a Marlin .22 caliber rifle or a Jennings J22 handgun. The detectives checked into local sales of these models of gun to see if anyone whose name was in the case file had bought one, but none had. Over time, the investigators came to believe it was much more likely that their suspect had used a handgun than a rifle, as there was evidence that Cathy was shot from close range, and a handgun would be much more easily concealed on the public trail. In her backpack, which did not appear to have been rifled through, were a paperback book, a bandana, a t-shirt, a hairbrush and toothbrush, an opener, a pair of sunglasses, 2 spiral notebooks, envelopes, and pens. One of the notebooks had a little blood on it that had seeped through from a bloody patch on the outside of the backpack. There was also a plain white cocktail napkin with writing on it. It said Bob Oiler and Dan the Bar Boy in ink. Finally, there was also a key ring with 3 keys on it and a business card for Jack of Some Trades. After the autopsy concluded, Detective Diffendafer returned to Thumb Butte, where deputies Starren and Smith had cordoned off the area and were searching it. They showed him some items of interest, 2 rocks, which had hair and blood on them. But these weren't boulders that Cathy could have fallen onto. These rocks fit into a human hand. They lay on the ground at what was estimated to be the initial point of assault, about 120 feet up the trail from where Cathy's body had been found. Analysis of the hair and blood revealed that they were Cathy's. Those rocks were murder weapons. Cathy's blood and hair were also found on the ratchet wrench Elizabeth R. had found up the trail. Detective Diffendafer went to the address listed on Cathy's license and knocked on the door. No one was home, but he spoke to neighbor Paula Lee. Paula said that Cathy did live there with a roommate named Christine T. Cathy was a student at Prescott College. So the detective contacted the college to obtain the next of kin information for Cathy. He was going to have to make a difficult phone call. Hi guys, I know I've talked to you about Factor meals in the past, but I've got some more to say. It's such a relief not to worry about dinner anymore. My husband and I both work long days, and most of the time neither of us is motivated to start prepping a from-scratch meal after work. And my teenager, forget it. But when we sit down to dinner, we prefer fresh, healthy meals with premium ingredients, and that's where Factor comes in. Factor delivers balanced, nutritious meals right to your doorstep with no prep work whatsoever. These are not TV dinners. Nothing is ever frozen. These are chef-crafted, restaurant-quality meals that are ready to heat and eat. But don't compromise your commitment to healthy, appropriately portioned meals that make your taste buds happy and you can feel good about. And with Factor's wide array of options, you'll have over 35 meals to choose from every single week. You design your own meal plan, whether it's Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. And Factor isn't just dinners. You can sign up to receive as many meals a week as you like. Factor offers snacks, breakfasts, and lunches too. They even have smoothies and yummy desserts among their menu of 60 add-ons. Best of all, it's flexible. You set your own menu weekly with as many or as few items as you need. And you can pause or reschedule your deliveries anytime. I'm telling you, Factor is a lifesaver. Try it for yourself. I think you'll be happy you did. Take advantage of the special offer Factor is extending to DNA ID listeners. And head to factormeals.com/DNA50 and use code DNA50 to get 50% off. That's code DNA50 at factormeals.com/DNA50 to get 50% off. That is a massive savings.
NASCAR on Prime lights up Music City. Who's got what it takes to tackle the concrete at Nashville Super Speedway and walk away with NASCAR's coolest trophy? Stream the NASCAR Cup Series at Nashville, Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, where music meets motorsports, only on Prime.
Catherine Ann Sposito was born to parents Grace and Natalie Sposito on September 7, 1963. She was the only daughter born to the couple, who also had sons Salvatore, Anthony, Joseph, and Matthew. Cathy grew up in Brooklyn, New York. Her mother, Grace, has said that although Cathy grew up in a rough neighborhood, she was never afraid of anything. According to Cathy's serious high school boyfriend, Peter, Cathy's neighborhood had plenty of drugs, but she stayed away from them and only smoked pot and drank on occasion. She was very outdoorsy and defied her New York Italian heritage by relocating to Prescott, Arizona in 1985 to attend Prescott College. Prescott is a private liberal arts college with the emphasis on sustainability and environmental awareness. According to its website, it is dedicated to ecologically focused education and to modeling sustainability through their operations and facilities. She went to the college during the 1985 to 1986 school year and then took a leave of absence during the 1986 to 1987 school year, I imagine to work and earn some money. She had enrolled for the upcoming 1987 fall semester, majoring in outdoor recreation and environmental studies. She was signed up to take basic rock climbing and wilderness studies and landscape exploration, all taught by David L. Cathy was a major outdoors enthusiast who loved hiking, camping, mountain biking, skiing, rock climbing, all of it. She had done a month-long outdoor adventure trip in Utah with one of her Prescott professors, David L., and their class. She was known to bike and hike alone. It would totally be in character for her to hike the Thumb Butte Trail early in the morning, solo. Cathy had just bought a Volkswagen that was not drivable, and it was being fixed up, but she was accustomed to getting everywhere on foot or on her Schwinn 10-speed mountain bike. Cathy was also an aspiring artist who was into all sorts of art, such as photography. One of her jobs was posing for a local artist, as we shall see. Other than going to school, Cathy had to pay the bills, so she worked as a cocktail waitress and bartender. She had previously worked at a local pub near the college called Murphy's from June to November 1986, but she'd moved over to Manuel's, where she was a waitress. Cathy had bounced around a bit in terms of her residence, too. She lived for a time with her friend Sherry S. Then she moved in with another friend, Heidi O., in October 1986. When she was killed, Cathy had been living with a roommate, Christine T., for several months. But Christine had decided to move in with her boyfriend, Bob, and was moving out of the women's shared apartment. Cathy had a number of ex-boyfriends. She had dated a guy named Paul L. shortly after arriving in Prescott. He had moved away in mid-'86. When she died, she was currently involved with someone, but it was long distance for the time being. David M. and Cathy started dating in August 1986. But now, in June 1987, he was living in Cooper's Landing, Alaska, for a summer job. They hadn't spoken on the phone since he left on May 17th. They stayed in touch via letters. With David away and school off for the summer, Cathy told some people she was bored in Prescott. Let's go back to the scene of the crime and what investigators were able to learn about what had happened to Cathy on that Saturday morning, June 13th. Detective Diffendafer interviewed Opal Waugh to get a handle on the precise timeline of events that day on the trail. Opal and her husband Roger were the ones who had first found Cathy and placed the blanket over her. Opal said she and Roger grabbed some donuts at their motel at 7:40 a.m. and arrived at Thumb Butte Park around 7:50 or 8. They chatted with the old man sitting at the picnic table. This was Russell. Around 8:05, they started up the left-hand Thumb Butte Trail, and at 8:10 or so, they found the body lying on the ground. Quote, she described the position of the victim as being the same as when I arrived on the scene, end quote. Opal's husband Roger felt Cathy's neck for a pulse and found none. So they ran down to the campground and asked Russell if there was a phone at the park. There wasn't. So they flagged down a white pickup truck with a CB radio. The driver summoned the police while they grabbed a blanket from their car to cover the body. On their way up the trail, they encountered Elizabeth R. carrying a wrench. She told them she'd found it up the trail from the body. They covered the dead woman with the blanket, and Roger followed the blood trips up the trail to where they started, near a large rock on the left-hand side of the trail. Detective Diffendafer interviewed Russell Haney on June 15th. He was the picnic bench sitter who had seen a young woman, believed to be Cathy, park her bike and head up the trail, and 15 to 20 minutes later heard a scream. Russell said the only other people he saw was an older man walking around the park who left in a pickup with a camper's shell. Before the man left the park, Russell asked him what time it was, and the man told him it was 7 a.m. Right after the man drove off was when Cathy rode up on her bike. And then this, Detective Diffendafer asked Russell if he could have heard a gunshot around the time that he heard the scream. By this time, he knew Cathy had been shot in the eye. Russell said he didn't think it was a gunshot, but he had heard what he thought was possibly a firecracker, because it wasn't very loud. It happened immediately following the scream. Then Russell remembered he did see some other people that morning. He'd seen a male jogger running up the dirt road toward Deering Park. This was later determined to be a local man named Bill T., who hadn't seen anything unusual that morning. Russell said about 5 to 7 minutes after he heard the scream and the firecracker, a man and a woman came running down the west trail and stopped at their car, which was parked in the lower parking lot. They talked for a bit and then got in their car and left. It appeared from his description that this couple was just out jogging. They had gone up the right-hand trail, the west side, around 7 a.m. Neither of them was carrying anything. They drove off toward Prescott. Detective Diffendafer was eager to identify them, so he arranged for Russell to compile an identikit composite at the Phoenix office of the Arizona Public Safety Crime Lab, and the composites were circulated to the Prescott area newspapers. By the way, it seems police weren't super interested in Russell as their suspect. He'd been seen sitting at the picnic table by several people, and he had no blood or anything suspicious on him. They did search Russell's illegal camping area, but found no guns. He just didn't set off anyone's hinky meters. And then they found 2 other witnesses whose statements emphasized how this tragedy might have been averted. Charla G. worked for the Arizona Public Service Department as a meter reader. She went to Thumb Butte Park to go running on the trails that morning. She left her house around 6:10, and it usually took her about 20 to 30 minutes to get to the park. She hiked up the left-hand trail and jogged down the right-hand trail. She finished around 7:30 a.m., and afterward, she was standing in the area of the picnic tables and spoke to a man sitting there, Russell, when a woman, later determined to be Cathy Sposito, rode up on her bike. This from the detective's report, quote, Charla stated that she did not know the victim, but that she'd seen her numerous times hiking and bicycling around Prescott. She watched the victim for a minute or two as the victim proceeded up the left-hand trail. She then started home, arriving at her residence at 8:05. The only other person she saw at the park was a woman with her dog. Jean D. was the woman with the dog. She was walking it in the area of the Thumb Butte Park trailhead on Saturday morning. She got there around 7 a.m. and went up the west trail, which was on the right. Up the trail a little ways, she met another woman that she saw at the trail regularly. The other woman was jogging down the trail. This was Charla. After they were done chatting, Jean walked with her dog back down to the campground area, and she was giving the dog some water when she heard something. She said she heard a woman's voice up the trail making sounds as if she were in pain. She heard the woman say, "Help me," and heard her make additional sounds indicating pain. Then she heard what she described as twack, 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 followed by silence. She called out to the person and asked if they were okay, but there was no response. Then she asked the man sitting at the picnic table to go with her up the trail to see if someone needed help. This person obviously was Russell. But Russell advised her that he was saving the picnic table for a group and he couldn't leave it. He said the noise was probably just kids and she shouldn't worry about it. Jean fretted and then decided to leave. She estimated the time was around 8 a.m. She was a second ear witness to Cathy's murder. On June 17th, Detective Diffendafer interviewed Elizabeth R., the woman who had found the wrench and then Cathy's body. She had a lot to say. She had left her house around 7:15 a.m. and arrived at Thumb Butte Park around 7:30. She had started up the right-hand trail and almost right away saw a man that she'd seen jogging on the trail before. He was about 38 years old, of medium height, slim build, and was wearing jogging shorts, sneakers, and a Walkman. He wasn't carrying anything. He got into his dark blue pickup truck with Nevada personalized license plates. She continued up the trail and almost immediately encountered a lady with a dog. This was Jean D. As she reached the turnstile on the trail, Elizabeth heard what she described as an argument between a man and a woman. The argument lasted for more than a few seconds and possibly as long as 2 minutes, but the only words she could distinguish were the words "help me" from the woman. The argument was followed by a gunshot, which was followed by silence. At first, Elizabeth was startled and thought something must be dreadfully wrong. But then she decided it was probably just a couple having a normal domestic squabble, and the gunshot was kids hunting squirrels. She proceeded up the right-hand trail, and once she got to the top, she started down the left-hand trail. As she was descending the lower part of the left-hand trail, she found the ratchet wrench lying on the ground. Proceeding downhill, she saw the blood drops and noticed the body. After checking for a pulse, she went down the trail to the turnstile where she ran into Opal and Roger, who told her not to go up there. She didn't see anyone else on the trail from the time she heard the gunshot to the time she discovered the body. Looking at the map with Detective Diffendafer, Elizabeth pointed out the location where she found the wrench, and it was exactly in the spot where he believed the initial point of assault had happened. Elizabeth was a third ear witness to Cathy's murder. So just to recap here, Cathy had biked up to Thumb Butte, parked her bike, and set off hiking the trail. Within 10 or so minutes, several people heard yelling, calls for help, and a gunshot, and then silence. Cathy was found a short time later by Opal and Roger. She'd been attacked higher up the trail, and a blood trail led down to where she lay. It was shocking. It seemed like an attack by a deranged person, presumably a transient or a drug-crazed homeless person. The Yavapai County investigators made lists of everyone in the area and tried to track them down and interview them all, particularly looking at people who might be off the grid and living in the woods. They checked out one transient who slept at his van and reportedly had a gun. They interviewed campers and released composites of 2 men and a woman who had been seen near the crime scene, whom they hoped might have information as witnesses. They gathered information on all vehicles spotted in the area that morning, in case the guy had parked at the trailhead or nearby. One guy initially piqued the detective's interest. This was Robert W., a transient who lived in his 1975 Dodge van a mile southwest of the park on Thumb Butte Road. He said he hadn't been near the Thumb Butte Park area on that Saturday morning, but they noted that he was on probation out of Tempe, Arizona, for shooting someone in 1986. Detective Diffendafer got permission to search Robert's van and found no guns, but did find a police nightstick, a set of handcuffs, and some black leather and metal-spiked wristbands. Robert also had blood on his T-shirt, which he said was from a cut a few days earlier. They collected that for testing. They checked on the gun Robert had been convicted of firing, and it was a .22 caliber pistol. None of that looked good, but a July 1st report by analyst Bob Blackett at the DPS Crime Lab said the blood on the T-shirt belonging to Robert W. was his own and not Cathy's. This lead was a bust. Detective Diffendafer managed to track down the guy with the personalized license plates Elizabeth R. had seen at the trailhead. This was Jeffrey Church, a patrolman with the Reno Police Department. When interviewed, he said that he was in Prescott running Thumb Butte Trail on the morning of the 13th. He went up the left-hand trail and came down the right. He didn't remember seeing anyone on the trail except for the lady with the black poodle, who turned out to be Jean D. He didn't see anything suspicious at all, and he had a trained law enforcement eye. Then some information came in that would lead indirectly to the main suspects in this case. Detective Diffendafer learned of some campers camped near Deering Park who said they'd been at Thumb Butte Campground on the 13th, the day of Cathy's murder. Their names were Mike T. and Wilma N. They were interviewed at their campsite. Mike and Wilma had stopped in at Thumb Butte Park on their way to Prescott between 6 and 7 a.m. to brush their teeth at the faucet. When they drove off, they observed a young woman riding a bicycle toward the park. She had a backpack on and appeared to be angry. Right behind her, on Thumb Butte Road, Mike saw a light yellow or cream-colored two-door sedan with 2 people in it, driving toward Thumb Butte Park. It was moving fast, and Mike felt it would have caught up with the bicycle and the girl on it in a matter of seconds. The driver was a man in his 20s, and Mike got a good look at him and was able to describe him to the police. It sounded to the investigators as though this car might have been chasing Cathy. She appeared to be angry or upset, and the car was speeding behind her with 2 people in it. More on that in a bit.
Every day, predators are targeting children and teens online. The Department of Homeland Security's Know to Protect campaign provides resources to combat online child exploitation and abuse. Learn how you can help protect our kids online and join the fight. Visit knowtoprotect.gov so together we can stop online child exploitation. That's KNOW, 2, protect.gov.
Investigators canvassed the residential neighborhoods that were near the Thumb Butte Trail. They also tried to figure out whether there were any unmarked trails that only locals would know that could lead to the Thumb Butte summit without someone using the main parking lot or trail. They couldn't figure out how this whole thing had gone down in daylight with a knife and a gun-wielding suspect covered in blood, able to disappear into the ether. Police also tried to trace the origin of the napkin in Cathy's backpack that said Bob Euler on it in handwriting. They asked around, but no one had heard of Bob Euler, and the napkin was a typical white paper cocktail napkin available at any bar. To this day, Bob Euler has not been identified. DPS lab analyst Bob Blackett issued a report that hair and fiber samples found on items at the scene did not match Cathy, but where they came from was anyone's guess. And a partial fingerprint on Cathy's helmet was not of a quality that was useful to the investigators. Many aspects of this case were extremely perplexing. As we've discussed, Cathy was a victim of overkill from an extremely brutal blitz attack in a very public place. That made no sense. But what also made no sense was the apparent lack of motive. From the physical evidence at the scene, it appeared Cathy was attacked and bludgeoned, shot and stabbed as she fought with her attacker. But why? There was no evidence of a robbery, and there was no indication of a sexual assault either. Why would someone do this? The investigators started to wonder if someone who knew Cathy had been enraged at her for some reason, lain in wait for her and killed her. And they thought it was possible that 2 people were involved, just based on the number of different weapons, the rocks, the ratchet wrench, the knife, the gun, that had been used. On the 14th, Detective Diffendafer started the process of interviewing everyone who knew Cathy. She had a lot of friends from both work and school, and a lot of acquaintances as well. The investigators talked to them all. They spoke with her friend and former roommate Sherry S. and her boyfriend Phil L., who were out of town when Cathy was killed. They talked to her boyfriend David M. They talked to a man named Tom Madry, a 76-year-old live-in Veterans Administration patient who had befriended Cathy about 15 months earlier, and the 2 often spent Saturdays together having lunch. It was innocent, and Tom wasn't involved. The detective sat down with Cathy's roommate, Christine T., and her boyfriend, Bob B., also a friend of Cathy's. Christine said Cathy didn't do drugs or hang out at bars except with her friends. She wasn't a party girl. But Christine had noticed that Cathy had started keeping condoms in her purse and in her room. This was interesting because her boyfriend, David M., was away in Alaska. Was Cathy seeing somebody new? The detectives had searched Cathy's room and found a letter from her boyfriend David M. and some other paperwork referencing the Golden Circle. They asked Christine T. what this was. She told them that the Golden Circle was a pyramid scheme they were all active in, where people sent $50 to a person on a list of names, and that person did the same, and they all ended up receiving $50 from lots of different people. This kind of thing was popular at the time, but it's definitely of questionable legality. Cathy, Chris, David, Cathy's friend Tracy, and several others were also involved in this. Cathy had attended a barbecue at the home of a couple named the McDonalds on June 6th that was 4 participants. The detectives had to look into this golden circle to see whether someone was angry at Cathy for bilking them out of cash or whatever the scheme entailed. But, spoiler alert, the pyramid scheme had nothing to do with Cathy's murder. It was just another angle that had to be investigated and ruled out. The investigators put together a timeline of the last 2 weeks of Cathy's life. It went like this. On June 4th, she worked 2 waitressing shifts at Manuel's. On June 5th, she called a construction worker and contractor she knew named Jim L., age 29, and asked him to meet her for a drink at Murphy's. They met at the bar around 9 p.m. According to Jim, she told him that she didn't want to be alone that night. Around 11, they went back to his place and spent the night there, and he confirmed that the 2 of them had sex. He drove her home the next morning and stayed talking with her for 3 hours before driving off around 9:30. She told him she was going on a trip to Utah in a couple of days. On June 6th, Cathy went to an evening barbecue at the McDonald's house with her roommate Christine and her boyfriend Bob. This was the Golden Circle members' barbecue. On June 7th, around 3, she left town on a trip to the national parks in Utah with Bob B's roommate and business partner, Jack J., whose business card had been found in Cathy's backpack. Jack was interviewed, and he said he met Cathy through his roommate and coworker Bob and Bob's girlfriend Christine, Cathy's roommate. Jack said he and Cathy were just friends, but they shared a common interest of hiking, backpacking, and camping. Jack ran into her at a bank earlier that week, and she told him she was bored because all her friends from college had left town for the summer, and she wanted to do something fun. So he had invited her along on his camping trip to Utah. They spent the week traveling around and going to all the various points of interest. They weren't intimate on this trip, they were just friends. They returned to Prescott around 1 or 1:30 p.m. on Friday, June 12th, the day before Cathy was murdered. Jack dropped her off at her house. He said they both had a great time, but Cathy was a little depressed about returning to Prescott. She also told him that she had more than one boyfriend and that one in particular who was in construction did not treat her right, but she didn't give him any names. At 4 o'clock that day, Cathy called into Manuel's for work and spoke with her coworker and friend Chris H. While she was away, her schedule had been changed and she had actually missed her shift that day. Around 5, she spoke with her neighbor, Paula Lee. She told her she had a great trip to Utah, but she didn't tell her any plans for the evening or Saturday. She was then seen by her friend Chris O. around 5 p.m. on her bike, heading south on Miller Valley Road by the Gasomat. Chris was driving by in his car. Shortly after that, around 5:30, Alan Weissman, a teacher at Prescott College who was friendly with Cathy, saw her at Mario's Pizzeria. She was alone and appeared to be paying for her food. She was talking with a female clerk she seemed to know. He saw her bicycle chained to a parking meter in front of the restaurant. Cathy called her travel buddy Jack later that evening, sometime between 7 and 8 p.m., and they talked about her Volkswagen, which was at Pearson's auto body being repaired. She said she had no plans for Saturday. It sounded like she was doing dishes, and her roommate, Christine, later confirmed that when she returned home at 10 a.m. the next day, Saturday, the dirty dishes she had left out were clean. That put Cathy at home early on Friday night, the night before she died. Later that evening, sometime between 8 and 9 p.m., Renee V. and his brother Tim saw Cathy at the other store on Miller Valley Road in Prescott. They were buying marshmallows and invited her to go camping with them, but she declined and mentioned that she intended to climb Thumb Butte in the morning. Tim recalled that Cathy was wearing red shorts and a t-shirt, which is what she was found wearing on Saturday morning. Just for the record, I think this sighting was actually earlier, when she was seen by her friend Chris O. riding her bike on Miller Valley Road. But the point was, she had told some people that she planned to hike Thumb Butte Trail in the morning, which meant to police that her killer might have known that she would be there and laid in wait for her to walk into his trap. And that's where the timeline for Cathy ended. The investigators spent a lot of time trying to figure out where Cathy had been on Friday night, because based on what they learned through their investigation, they did not believe that Cathy had spent Friday night at her own house. Paula Lee, Cathy's neighbor, had no idea what Cathy had done on the evening of Friday, June 12th, but she said she let her dog out on Saturday morning at 5 a.m., and she noticed that Cathy's bicycle was not there. It was always parked right next to the side door to Cathy and Christine's house. Paula said it was very unusual for Cathy to get up and early enough to be gone by 5 in the morning. The police notes state, quote, "This fact is particularly noteworthy due to the fact that the victim's car was broken down and the bicycle was the victim's only mode of transportation, which is also indicative of the fact that the victim did not spend the night at home on June 12, 1987, end quote. Where had Cathy spent the night of June 12th to 13th, mere hours before she was slain on the Thumb Butte Trail? This is where Jim L. and Gary S. enter the picture. Jim and Gary worked together at a construction site in nearby Chino Valley. They were interviewed by Detective Diffendafer on June 17th after Jim called and said he knew Cathy Sposito. During the interview, both Jim and Gary said they'd only known Cathy for a short time, ever since she was a waitress at Murphy's, and they were just casual friends. But then Jim told the detective that around 7 p.m. on June 5th, Cathy called him and asked him to meet her at Murphy's bar at 9 o'clock. We talked about that in the timeline section a little while ago. They had a drink or two. She said she didn't want to be alone that night, and they went to his house and spent the night. He drove her home on June 6th, and that was the last time he saw her, he said. She was leaving for Utah the next day. In this interview, both Jim and Gary said that within the last 2 or 3 weeks, Cathy appeared as if something was bothering her. She told them she had to get out of town. They both said they felt that possibly she was afraid of someone or that someone was after her. It seems the police thought that this was designed to throw them off the scent. Quote from the police report here. "During our conversation with Jim and Gary, they appeared to be attempting to elicit information from us about how the victim was killed. Several times during our conversation, Jim made the statement, 'Well, I just wish I knew what happened just to ease my own conscience.'" Detective Diffendafer had a follow-up interview with Jim L. on July 8th. He was still trying to place Cathy somewhere besides her own house on the night before she died. Jim stuck to his story that June 6th was the last time he saw Cathy. When he was asked what he thought happened to her, he said she had made a lot of noise and put up a fight, so she had to be stabbed and shot to shut her up. Well, the shooting had not been publicly released. Jim was not supposed to know about that. When asked how he knew she'd been shot, Jim said that he'd been allowed into the county morgue by a friend and he'd been able to see Cathy's body. There was more. On July 20th, Detective Bill Robbins interviewed Tammy L., a bartender at Murphy's bar. Tammy was a crucial witness because she finally was able to provide the missing puzzle piece about where Cathy was on Friday night, June 12th to 13th. Tammy knew Cathy very well because they'd been co-workers at Murphy's, where Cathy had been a cocktail waitress. And Tammy was 100% certain that she saw Cathy between 9 and 10 p.m. on Friday night, June 12th. Tammy was tending bar, and Cathy was sitting at the bar with Jim L. Both of them were drinking beer. She even remembered what they'd ordered. Jim ordered a steak sandwich for which a food ticket was written up. She said it appeared that the two were on a date that had been prearranged. She said Cathy made a gesture to her with a thumbs up or a thumbs down and side-eyeing Jim, silently asking Tammy to signal what she thought of her date. Tammy gave her the sideways thumb, meaning she was indifferent. The detective verified the crucial June 12th date by confirming that Tammy had indeed worked that night and that she had not worked the previous Friday night, which is the night Jim had admitted that he and Cathy were together at Murphy's. The investigators actually found the ticket for the sale of the steak sandwich and a salad and some red wine, and also found the bar tab. Tammy's sighting of Cathy with Jim L. on June 12th was confirmed by several people, including Patricia T., a waitress at Murphy's that Friday night. She knew Cathy well as co-workers at the bar. She said Cathy was with Jim L. and was wearing shorts. Mike P. knew both Jim and Cathy because he was involved in the construction industry and was also attending Prescott College. He definitely saw them together on Friday night at Murphy's. So did Burton A., who knew Cathy and knew Jim. Another woman remembered Cathy wearing red shorts. It was undeniably her. Police ended up finding 5 witnesses who had seen Cathy and Jim L. together at Murphy's and had seen them leave together. It was clear that not only had Jim L. been the person with Cathy on Friday night, he had deliberately lied about it. He maintained that the witnesses were mistaken, but they weren't. Cathy left the bar with him and died the next morning on the Thumb Butte Trail. Jim L. had no alibi for the night of June 12th. He said that evening he was home alone watching TV. He said his roommate, Gary S., went out that night, but he came home late and watched some TV with him before they both turned in. On the morning of the 13th, Jim said he got up at 6 a.m. and started working on his truck. Gary left on his motorcycle. So Jim was by himself at his house until noon, and he didn't speak with anyone during that entire time. Around noon, he rode his motorcycle up to Thumb Butte to see if anyone he knew was there, and that's when he saw police vehicles and noticed the crime scene tape. Jim continued to deny seeing Cathy on the night of the 12th. He denied having anything to do with her murder, and he denied owning the kind of gun that had killed her. Police found more evidence that Jim L. was lying. They interviewed the landlord who owned the home where Gary and Jim lived. This was Naomi B. She reported that the morning after the murder, this would have been Sunday, Jim showed up at her door crying and upset, saying that Cathy Sposito had been murdered. He told her about the specific details of what happened to Cathy, and that he'd been with her the night before she was killed. Jim said he learned the details of the murder from several people, including EMTs at the scene. But the detectives found it suspicious as hell that Jim L. came up with a very detailed story about how he thought Cathy had been killed. He said he thought more than one guy had hit her with rocks, but she got away and ran down the trail. They caught up with her, stabbed her in the ear, and shot her in the eye. It just seemed that he knew way too much about what happened to Cathy, and of course, his lying to them about being with her was a major red flag. This was when the detectives harkened back to the witnesses Wilma and Mike T. They're the ones who saw Cathy on her bike pedaling toward the Thumb Butte Trail, looking angry as a car seemed to be chasing her. Wilma and Mike were re-interviewed on July 28th by Detective Robbins. He showed them a photo of Gary S.'s 1967 cream-colored Chevy sedan, and Mike confirmed it was the same car he'd seen that day. He recognized the damage to the left front end. And then he picked Jim L. out of a photo lineup as the driver of the car. Jim and Gary had said nothing about being together near Thumb Butte on the morning of the murder. In fact, they both claimed to be elsewhere and alone. Gary S.'s interview pretty much backed up Jim L.'s statements. He said he'd met Cathy about a year ago when she was working at Murphy's. He said he knew Jim had hooked up with Cathy, and she spent the night on June 5th, but he never saw her because they were in Jim's room. He said she was never at their place on the night of the 12th to 13th. It's very clear that the police believe that Gary was lying to cover for his roommate, and that he was possibly involved in what happened to Cathy. Remember the two perpetrator theory. Police notes refer to Gary S. as, quote, another prime suspect. This was because Gary, too, had extensive details about how Cathy had been beaten, stabbed in the ear, and shot in the eye. He said he learned the details from an employee at the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office and a member of the ambulance crew at the scene, whom he would not identify. This is a quote from the police report. Both Gary and Jim had detailed knowledge of the nature and extent of the victim's injuries within a day of the murder. This information was not public knowledge. Additionally, a person interviewed, Kimberly G., reported that Gary had stated the victim had been stabbed in the ear with a screwdriver. This was not a conclusion of the medical examiner, who noted she'd been stabbed in the ear. Of note, the autopsy photo of the victim's right ear shows what appear to be 2 circular puncture wounds that could be consistent with the stem of a screwdriver. End quote. The medical examiner did not opine in his report as to what kind of implement had made the wounds, but looking at the photos, the police thought Gary might just know what he was talking about. Gary S. consented to a search of his apartment and being fingerprinted and photographed. On July 8th, Detective Diffendafer went to Gary and Jim's house. There, he took photos of a car parked in the driveway, a cream-colored 1967 Chevy two-door sedan registered to Gary. Quote, the vehicle matched a description of the vehicle seen by Mike T. driving toward Thumb Butte Park at approximately 7 a.m. on the morning of June 13th, end quote. Also found were some tools. Quote, we also examined the suspect's tools and found them to have various Craftsman brand tools, including 2 half-inch Craftsman wrenches, end quote. This was the same type and size wrench that had been found at the scene and was believed to be one of the murder weapons. The detectives noted with interest that Jim L. told them he was alone Saturday morning working on his truck, an activity that required tools. Gary S. admitted that he owned 3 guns, but said that none of them were a .22 caliber. However, a witness whom police interviewed related that Gary owned a .22 caliber conversion kit for his 9mm handgun. The detectives also noted that Gary was left-handed. Cathy had been stabbed in the right ear and her right front tooth was punched out. injuries consistent with being inflicted by a left-handed person. Finally, the rumor mill had it that Jim and Gary were dealing cocaine and crack. These were pretty rough guys, not the types that Cathy would typically dally with. And so much of the circumstantial evidence pointed to them, but there was no hard evidence. Jim L. agreed to take a polygraph exam. It consisted of just 3 questions about whether he was involved in Cathy's murder. I don't have a copy of the specific questions, but the examiner concluded that Jim was not being truthful on 2 out of the 3 questions. Gary S. took that same polygraph exam, and although not being assessed as untruthful, he had a, quote, physical reaction to a question on the type of gun being used in the murder. Police continued to keep an eye on Jim and Gary while months passed. Another guy who was considered but police never caught up with at the time was Denny T. 8 days after the murder, someone called in saying that a resident at a specific address on Pine Drive was the killer. This house was 228 yards from where Jim and Gary were living. The lots actually backed up to each other, and the house had a view of Thumb Butte. It was that close. When police approached this house to question the residents, the man ran from the house and vanished into the woods. His then live-in girlfriend named Teresa B. answered the door and told the deputies that Denny beat her up and said he would kill her. Teresa said, when asked, that she didn't know whether Denny had killed the woman on Thumb Butte. He did have a record, including an incident in Alaska where he was charged with kidnapping. This was a 1983 incident where Denny and his friends were robbed, and they caught the guys red-handed and held them at gunpoint, while they made one of the robbers go get money to pay them for the damages. Denny was charged with kidnapping but acquitted. Now, police had just a vague tip about an address, not even a name, and the Denny T. lead dropped off their radar when he absconded from the area. Then there was Bill H. Cathy's good friend Janet Sarkett and her traveling buddy Jack J. called Detective Diffendaver about Bill. He had been present at the Golden Circle barbecue at the McDonald's house. After Cathy's death a few days later, Janet said she ran into him at a diner, and he basically unloaded some very weird stuff on her. He told Janet he liked to sit and observe the Prescott College students and fantasize about being with them. That's not creepy. Then he launched into his feelings about Cathy. He had wanted to date her even though he didn't really know her. He called her a woodland nymph and a sexy angel. Bill also requested Janet to accompany him to Thumb Butte Park so they could talk further about Cathy. He was insistent about wanting to take her there so he could get in touch with his feelings at the place where Cathy had died. Janet felt uncomfortable and declined because creepy. Cathy's roommate Christine T. knew this guy Bill also. She confirmed that he was definitely interested in Cathy and went into a significant depression after she was killed. Detective Robbins interviewed Bill on August 4th. He said he'd met Cathy a few times and invited her to breakfast, but she declined. He admitted wanting to date her and said that her death depressed him. He admitted calling her a sexy angel and a wood nymph, but he said he thought she was pretty and he would never hurt her. This guy was a dramatic weirdo who overly sexualized Cathy, someone he barely knew, and seemed to be taking her death extremely hard, so it's easy to understand why police side-eyed him, but it's not clear what happened to this person of Interest Avenue. Bill H. died before modern DNA technology caught up, so he was never tested. But now we know he was just a weirdo, and he wasn't the one who killed Cathy. Then there was Rick Sylvester. The detectives learned that this local artist and painter had paid Cathy to be a portrait model for him. Sylvester was interviewed on August 4th, and he acknowledged that he'd paid Cathy $6 an hour to pose for him. But he said he hadn't seen her in over a year. He completely downplayed their interactions, saying he'd never painted her during a sitting because she was too antsy to be a good model, so he'd only photographed her. But then a March 1988 article in the Prescott Courier titled "Co-ed's Spirit Survives on Campus" gushed about Sylvester's paintings of Cathy. He referred to her as a dark-eyed beauty and said that Cathy posed for him for several months, contradicting what he said in his police interview. The article in the Courier said that Sylvester continued to paint Cathy's face long after he stopped working with her. He described her as moody, Mona Lisa-like, very photogenic, and himself as being attracted to her. "I was totally enamored with her as a model," he said. Even more bizarre, Sylvester continued to paint her after her death, including one painting a year after she was killed. He talked about Cathy having a certain mystique about her face and becoming intimate with her being by painting her. He said painting Cathy kept her alive, and when, quote, "you continued to love them for what they were," end quote. Things got weirder when Sylvester contacted Cathy's family. He sent photos of his paintings to Cathy's mother, Grace, and the two talked on the phone. She was overwhelmed by his work, he said. Then Sylvester sent his original Cathy portrait to Grace. 27-year-old Sal Sposito, Cathy's brother, told the Prescott Courier that his mother placed the painting of her dead daughter on an easel in the kitchen. He admitted that they found the portrait disturbing. Quote, "There's a sadness almost in that picture. There's no smile or anything." Cathy's parents were divorced, but her father, Natali, had a similar reaction. He broke into sobs on the phone with the reporter, saying, "I've seen it. I love the portrait, but I'm looking at my daughter who is dead. I don't keep no pictures of my daughter because it would only bring back memories." End quote. Sylvester, the painter's name, remained on the suspect list. So within a few months of the murder, there were 2 prime suspects and several persons of interest, but nothing concrete tying any of them to Cathy's murder. And police were still pursuing various theories about the seemingly motiveless crime targeting a young woman with no enemies. Some examples of these theories. Perhaps someone wanted to silence Cathy for something she knew or was going to do that the suspects, plural, were opposed to her doing. Jim L. and Gary S. killed her for unknown reasons, perhaps because of their drug dealings or she rejected one or both of them. As reported by tipsters, perhaps Cathy was killed because her father was in the mob back east. A rumor started to spread and persisted for decades that Cathy was from New Jersey, her Italian dad was mobbed up, and she was targeted and killed because of something her father was involved in. Cathy was from Brooklyn, not New Jersey. Her dad wasn't in the mafia. It was a sexy theory, but it wasn't true. Cathy had been poisoned. This was because her tox screen showed the presence of a toxin, which I will never be able to pronounce even if I try. This was one commonly found in insecticides and used for corrosion and rust prevention. No one could figure out why Cathy had this in her bloodstream, and it was unclear whether the levels were toxic or not. No one reported her feeling ill, but it was thought that perhaps someone had tried to poison her, and when that failed, had instead attacked her on the trail. This theory was always a remote possibility, but lab analysis was never able to generate enough information to allow investigators to draw any conclusions. And finally, the last plausible theory listed by police was the simple, generic, and vague victim was attacked and killed by unknown assailant while hiking Thumb Butte. In short, they just didn't know. Shockingly, the brazen daytime blitz attack homicide in a public place with multiple ear witnesses had police stymied. In December 1987, an announcement appeared in the local paper, the Prescott Courier, that a reward was being supplied by friends of Cathy Sposito. The $9,000 put up by this unnamed group of friends was supplemented by $1,000 from the Silent Witness program, bringing the total to $10,000. It went unclaimed. Time passed, and while the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office continued to work the case, as is evident in the case files I received, little progress was made.
Every day, predators are targeting children and teens online. The Department of Homeland Security's Know to Protect campaign provides resources to combat online child exploitation and abuse. Learn how you can help protect our kids online and join the fight. Visit knowtoprotect.gov so together we can stop online child exploitation. That's KNOW, the number 2, protect.gov.
On the second anniversary of Cathy's murder in 1989, the Prescott Courier ran an article about the investigation still being active, but the YCSO having no motive and no suspect. The article says that Detective Gordon Diffendafer continued to follow up on leads, but that, quote, they have little to show for their efforts, and Miss Sposito's murderer is likely lurking somewhere on the planet. Well, lurking he was. In 1990, it happened again. Not exactly the same crime, but an attack on another young woman. On April 22, 1990, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office responded to a call that came in at 8:10 a.m. from the Yavapai Regional Medical Center ER. A hospital employee told responding officers D. Martin and S. Clerkin that a 33-year-old woman had been sexually assaulted on the Thumb Butte Trail around 7:20 a.m. The survivor, referred to by the YCSO as victim number 2, but whom I'm giving the pseudonym Sarah, reported the following. Sarah, her daughter, and her boyfriend were visiting the area from Chandler and camping with some new friends in the woods. They set up camp about 3/4 of a mile from the Thumb Butte campground. Very early on Sunday morning, April 22nd, while everyone else was still asleep, Sarah walked to the Thumb Butte campground to use the restroom, and on impulse decided to climb the trail alone. Around 7:20 in the morning, she was descending the trail, having passed the halfway point at the top of the west trail and on her way back to the campground on the east trail. She was in the rocky switchback area of the trails when she heard someone running behind her. Assuming it was a jogger, she moved to the side and turned to look back, and as she did, a man pushed her hard to the ground, cutting open her knee on a rock. He jumped on top of her as she was on her back and held a jagged rock the size of a softball over her head. He told her to lie still and be quiet, implying that he would hit her with the rock if she resisted or screamed. From the report, quote, he then pulled down her sweatpants and underwear and inserted his fingers into her vagina. He then had oral sexual contact with her vulva and then forced her to have oral sexual contact with his penis by inserting it in her mouth, end quote. This was after he said, "I want you to give me some head, lady." He didn't have an erection and removed his penis after a brief time. He then lay on top of her and tried to have sexual intercourse with her but could not get an erection. He touched her genitals with a cigarette filter and then he got up, zipped his pants, and ran back up the trail the way he came. Sarah limped down the trail, taking about 5 minutes to get to the bottom. There she was met by Jean Miller, who ran the Thumb Butte campground. Jean saw that Sarah was very upset and injured. She put Sarah in her truck and drove her the short distance to where her group was camped. The rest of the group had awakened in her absence and become concerned about her whereabouts. When she and Jean drove up, with Sarah crying and distraught, her boyfriend had stumbled into the woods to pee, and he emerged to find people yelling for him that Sarah needed him ASAP. Sarah was driven in her boyfriend's car to the Yavapai Regional Medical Center, where she was seen by Dr. David Duncan. She had a 9-centimeter laceration on her knee that required internal and external stitches. A rape kit was done and pubic hair combings collected. They also collected her underwear, blue sweatpants, blue t-shirt, and white sweatshirt. Sarah told the investigators that she and her boyfriend had had sex the night before, but he had used a condom, so hair and blood samples were collected from him for elimination purposes. They also collected a blood sample from Sarah. All this was placed in the evidence locker at the YCSO. Sarah was able to describe her attacker in great detail. He was clean-cut, a blonde, white male, young, aged 15 to 19, with buck teeth and a blue tattoo on his right bicep. He was about 5'6", maybe 5'8", and 135 pounds. His wavy hair was cut shorter in the front and collar length in back. He was wearing a new-looking slate blue scoop neck sleeveless shirt with black stripes at the bottom, also new-looking black jeans, white sneakers, and a dangly gold cross earring in his left ear. She didn't know his eye color. This woman's recall was remarkable. Clearly she had studied the details she observed and committed them to memory in hopes they would help identify her attacker. He had placed his gold and white pack of Marlboros on the ground by her head while he assaulted her, and she turned her head and looked at the pack. She noted a white piece of paper with 3 digits written on it tucked inside the cellophane. The numbers were redacted in my copy of the file, but were guessed to possibly be part of a phone number. When asked, Sarah said she didn't detect any odors or scents on her assailant. Sarah also believed there was a small gray car parked in the campground at the base of the trail when she started her hike, but she had seen no other people on the trail that morning. She had no idea where the suspect had run to after he ran up the trail away from her. She found out later that after she left for the hospital, some of the other guys in her camping group went up the trail with guns looking for the assailant, but found no one. On April 30th, Detective Cox went to Sarah's home in Chandler and showed her 2 sets of photo lineups. I don't know who was in these lineups, but an educated guess would be Jim L. and Gary S. But Sarah said the man who assaulted her was not in either lineup. They also went through the Prescott High School yearbook with Sarah, given the estimated age of her assailant, but she didn't find him. The lab analyzing Sarah's clothing detected semen stains on her sweatshirt and underwear, and sperm was visible in the vaginal swabs taken at her rape kit. Sarah's belief that her rapist had never ejaculated during the assault led everyone to believe that these semen stains and sperm samples came from her boyfriend, as the two had had sex in a tent the night before the incident. But as she said, he had worn a condom. In August 1990, Detective Diffendaver returned to Sarah's home and asked her to go over the whole story one more time. He was still investigating, trying to find Sarah's attacker and see if he could link him to Cathy's murder. For pretty much everyone suspected that the 2 cases were connected. They were on the same trail at the same time of day, both on weekend mornings, both women hiking alone, and the same MO down to the rock. There was no way it wasn't the same guy. But Sarah's rape investigation proved just as frustrating as Cathy's murder. Detective Diffendaffer's report to the file on January 29, 1991 reads, "As of this date, no new leads have been developed. Case closed pending additional leads or information." Okay, back to Cathy's murder investigation. Detective Diffendaffer was still on the case in 1997, 10 years after the homicide. I'm not going to go into all the investigative tangents that were pursued, but trust me, there were a lot. But the main focus of the investigation continued to be Jim L. and Gary S., the two men considered the prime suspects in Cathy's murder. Detective J.A. Jarrell interviewed a good friend of Cathy's who had never been talked to before. This was Tracy T. She was convinced that Jim L. had killed Cathy. She said Cathy rejected his advances the night before the murder and he was angry. She turned out to cite her psychic visions as the basis of her hunch, but Detective Jarrell gathered rumors from various people about Jim L. beating up his girlfriends and that he was dealing both meth and coke at the time of Cathy's murder. Some other people reported that they heard that Jim had killed his girlfriend after a fight. Detective Jarrell noted they had never gotten full cooperation from Gary S., so they decided to try again. On July 20th, 1999, Detective Jarrell and Yavapai County Attorney's investigator Roger Williamson traveled to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to track down and interview Gary. When they contacted him, he became agitated and upset, saying basically that back in 1987, the YCSO had tried to railroad him and Jim, twisted their words, and tried to pin Cathy's murder on the two of them. Once again, he refused to cooperate, saying his attorney advised him not to talk to the Yavapai authorities. Jim L., on the other hand, did agree to a new interview, which took place on August 31st, 1999, at the YCSO headquarters. He basically claimed not to remember a lot of stuff. He said that he and Cathy had gone out for dinner or drinks at least once, but he was very vague. He could not recall that Cathy ever spent the night at their place. He expressed displeasure with the original investigation because the cops had focused on him, but he was now willing to do whatever needed to be done to help the police find the killer, he said. He soon retracted that and told the investigators that they were going to have to talk to his attorney because he had done enough. The investigation stalled again. A 2010 article on Cathy's case in the Prescott Daily Courier cites Yavapai County's Lieutenant Scott Masher as saying he felt strongly that the suspect or suspects knew Cathy. This was because even though the investigation had stalled, they still suspected OG suspects Jim and Gary. The article said that the sheriff's office was still requesting information from the public and there was still a reward in place. Behind the scenes, the YCSO had implemented a cold case investigative team made up of volunteers. They pored over the case file and came up with some things to follow up on. One of these investigators, Rich Finston, made a number of recommendations as to how possibly to advance Cathy's case. He said they should follow up on the anonymous tip called in 8 days after the murder, pointing to a house very near the crime scene. This was where Denny T. was living. But an old city directory also listed a Richard T. living at this address. He had never been looked into. And then there was the old Gary S. and Jim L. Finston reviewed the files carefully and noted all the things that pointed to the involvement of one or both of these men. Within a day of Cathy's murder, they both shared detailed information about the crime with others. Somehow they were in the know. And Jim S. had claimed first that this was because a friend led him into the county morgue to see Cathy's body. Then he claimed he got the details from paramedic Lee R. So Lee R. was interviewed in April of 2012. When investigator Finston asked him whether anyone outside the circle of EMTs and firefighters had requested information about the case, Lee immediately identified Jim L. as seeming overly interested in it. He said he told Jim the details and Jim became very upset. However, Lee told Finston that he had not told Jim these details until at least a week after the murder. Finston noted that Jim knew these details the day after the murder. He knew this because his landlord, Naomi B., had been interviewed and said so. Finston tracked down and interviewed Naomi B. on June 27th of 2012. She was 95 years old at this time, but seemed very alert. She remembered that the police were investigating the potential involvement of her two tenants, Jim and Gary, in connection with Cathy's murder. She confirmed that Jim had come to her house on the morning after the murder and was upset and crying. He told her and her husband that Cathy had been killed and that they shot and stabbed her, end quote. He said he had gone to dinner with Cathy the night before the murder. Naomi said he was despondent and suddenly began attending church right away. None of this was new information, but it validated the Yavapai investigators' decades-old suspicions of Jim L. and Gary S. It was time to either definitively rule them in or rule them out. Investigator Finston initiated DNA testing on the materials and evidence in Cathy's case, which had never been done before. Testing was conducted in March of 2013 on the swabs taken around Cathy's mouth for the assailant's DNA. Remember, Dr. Wyke suspected she'd been punched in the mouth by a fist. Sure enough, the analysis confirmed the presence of male DNA. Testing was also conducted on the ratchet wrench, which is found to have had Cathy's DNA on it and some mixed-in male DNA. Consistent partial composite YSTR profiles were also noted on one of the bloody rocks that had been used to hit Cathy and on Cathy's underwear. None of these were complete DNA profiles, and they were mixtures, but they did have enough DNA for comparison purposes. But when Jim L. willingly gave a DNA sample, these partial male DNA profiles did not match the genetic markers in his DNA. If he'd been involved, his DNA hadn't been detected on anything. But his buddy, Gary S., refused to provide a DNA sample. Investigator Finston noted that the nature and extent of Cathy's multiple injuries suggested that more than one person may have been involved, and the damage to the right side of her face was consistent with being inflicted by a left-handed person, like Gary S. Gary wasn't cooperating, but as you know, police have ways of obtaining DNA from unwilling suspects. I wasn't permitted to gather any information on this incident, but I know they conducted a trash pull on Gary, and in the end, he was eliminated as the suspect because the DNA on a piece of his dental floss, taken from his trash, did not match the partial male profile in evidence. Now they knew that the samples they had didn't match up with Jim or Gary. By the way, because I know you're wondering about this, the male profiles the Yavapai investigators were working with were all mixed partials. They could use them to test against direct samples from suspects, like Jim and Gary, but they were not sufficient for entry into CODIS. So once Jim and Gary were ruled out, the case stalled again. In 2016, Detective Dan Pritchard had taken up the Cathy Sposito case. Her brother Sal came out to Prescott to meet with detectives and make a public plea for someone to come forward with any information. The unsolved murder was still very much in the forefront in Prescott. One of Cathy's high school classmates wrote an email to other mutual classmates saying, quote, "I happened to be in Prescott, Arizona this past weekend with my husband, and of course she," referring to Cathy, "was on my mind. While strolling out of one of the downtown shops, I was stopped in my tracks by a large poster in the window with Cathy's photo. Apparently the police there continue all these years later to search for her killer. We saw the same poster in a number of local windows throughout the town. I was glad to see that her memory and the quest for justice remain alive," end quote. There was still a $10,000 reward being offered in Cathy's case, but it was going to take modern technology, not a tip, to bring Cathy's case to resolution. Detective Pritchard's goal was to obtain DNA samples from many of the men in the case file and compare them against the partial profiles they had obtained from the various items of evidence. He started with Cathy's traveling companion, Jack J. Detective Pritchard called him up and explained that they were still investigating Cathy's case and they were looking for a DNA sample from him. Jack said sure, he was glad to help. He went down to the Trenton, Missouri Police Department and gave buccal swabs on May 25th. When it was tested, his DNA was not a match to any of the DNA found on Cathy, the rock, or the wrench. Detective Pritchard noted that Roderick Sylvester, the guy who had paid Cathy to be a nude model for painted portraits, had never been tested for DNA. Unfortunately, Sylvester had been killed in a motorcycle accident in June 1992 in Prescott. So the detective contacted his living brother, M. M agreed to provide a buccal swab to compare to the DNA evidence obtained in this case, and the Honolulu police collected his sample on June 23, 2016. When the results came in, they ruled out his dead brother. Detective Pritchard located and interviewed Denny T. on March 22, 2017. You'll recall he was the resident of the Pine Drive home at the address called in by an anonymous caller 8 days after the murder. He was now living in a nursing home in Virginia. He remembered the murder and admitted that he climbed Thumb Butte often and drank beer in the woods. But he said he had no idea why someone would call in his address as being the residence of the killer, and he denied having anything to do with it. He willingly gave a DNA sample and told them to catch the guy. It wasn't Denny T. either. Detective Pritchard interviewed David L. on February 21, 2017. He was Cathy's professor at Prescott, and he was still working at the college. 8 days after Cathy was killed, David and his wife had turned into the YCSO a piece of jewelry, a bracelet or anklet, that they had found on the Thumb Butte Trail. But 1980s investigators had never followed up with him on where this item was found or asked him about it. Now, in 2017, David said that yes, Cathy was a student of his, but he only knew her in the context of a student-teacher relationship. He said that after the murder, he and his wife had gone for a hike because they lived near Thumb Butte and they wanted to see the area where the murder took place. There was still some crime scene tape left up. While on the trail, they found the piece of jewelry lying on the trail sort of trampled into the ground, and they thought it was weird that it might have been missed, so they turned it in. Now, on April 5, 2017, David L., his wife, and YCSO personnel, including Rich Finston and Detective Pritchard, met at Thumb Butte Trail to try to find the spot where the bracelet had been found. David led them to it, and it turned out not to be near where Cathy was found. David L. gave a voluntary buccal swab as well. This bracelet or anklet is still in evidence, but there's no indication that it belonged to Cathy or was in any way related, and let's hope the police would have found it on the day of the murder if it was. In observance of the 20th anniversary of Cathy's murder in 2017, the Yavapai investigators released a little bit more information about Cathy's case in connection with a request for information. Now, Sheriff Masher announced that they were seeking a small-caliber gun used in her murder, and that such a gun was possibly dumped between the Thumb Butte Trail and Castle Canyon. They envisioned that the killer might have jettisoned the gun as he fled the scene, and that someone had found it and would turn it in. No such luck. This is the end of Part 1 of the Cathy Sposito case. Part 2 is available right now.